And Alison is going to speak to us about the cultural significance of herbaria, past and present. Please welcome Alison Colwell.
Julie asked me to give this introduction to talk about the history of herbaria, specimens, and reasons to use herbaria as an introduction to the other speakers who are going to talk about some of the innovative things that herbaria are doing. She asked me because she knows I'm a big fan of herbaria since I was adopted by an herbarium as a forlorn undergraduate, and I've been hanging around in them ever since. Besides enjoyment, I keep going because I work on a group of parasitic plants. They're subterranean. They only come up some years to flower, so it's pretty much impossible to just go find them. You have to be the beneficiary of specimens of those who've stumbled across them in the past. So I go to herbaria to find out where to look for these plants. So to give this talk, I thought it'd be fun to learn a little bit myself about the history of herbaria. So I'm going to walk you through the ancient roots of herbaria and talk about the modernization of herbaria that Carl Linnaeus gave us, and talk a little bit about why, if you're not involved with herbaria, you might consider doing so. How many people in this audience use a herbarium regularly? Okay, so a good portion of you are the choir I'm speaking to. The rest of you, I hope I convince you. I don't know how many people besides myself have met their husband or spouse in an herbarium. So yeah, I'm a bit of an outlier in that case. So this photo is a picture of E.L. Green's botany lab and herbarium in South Hall at UC Berkeley, circa 1895. His graduate students were Willis Jepson, you can see him at the left, and he shared the lab with fellow students Marshall Howe and Joseph Burke Davy and Ivor Tidestrom. And, okay, how did herbaria get started? The term herbarium appears to come down to us from the ancient Latin herbarii, referring to the herb dealers whose business it was to know the medicinal and culinary properties of plants and how to tell the difference between them. The written documentation, that's right. Let's see. Where do I hold this to make it advance?
The arrow to the right, pass to the right of the center.
Yeah, it's not working.
Point at the screen.
Point it at the screen? No. All right. There we go. So written documentation of plants useful for medicine goes back thousands of years to the ancient Sumerians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. The description of the plants, their uses, and accompanied by increasingly sophisticated visuals, as in this herbal, from each of these cultures survives over many centuries. The herbals were coupled with a living collection called the Physic Garden in training physicians. This example, the Leonhard Fuchs herbal from 1543 was created by a German physician and botanist, and he himself promoted the use of unified Latin and Greek names for plants, and he is commemorated with the genus Fuchsia, or Fuchsia. This is a recently republished version of his personal hand-lettered, hand-painted original copy. This herbal was then copied and woodcuts were made and it was printed in Latin. This version is highly sophisticated because of the accuracy of this illustration. You'll recognize this plant Sonchus. The description at the bottom in German, gorgeously hand-lettered, he explains that because of the welter of German common names for this plant. He's assigning the Latin common name Sonchus. And then he goes on to talk about the differences between the two species that he was aware of at the time. So in Europe, these regional herbals developed rapidly in the 16th century, spurred by the technological breakthroughs of commercial paper making, which was way cheaper than hand tanning vellum. And then the invention of the printing press, which was again way cheaper than hand lettering books. And in addition, the standardization of language, of use of the Latin language for scientific communication made the audience of each of these herbals quite a bit bigger. So, yes, that works. All right. So, like many innovations whose time had arrived, what is known as the Hortus siccus, the literally dried plant herbarium, appeared to have been invented simultaneously in several parts of Europe in the late 1500s. Because paper had become cheap enough, botanical gardens seem to have begun producing what they called exsiccate, or dried pressed excerpts of their living collections for sale and distribution. These were, these were always little snippets, many to a page, usually arranged alphabetically, and always bound in a book. And this one in particular was thought to have been produced in Padua, Italy, at a botanical garden, 70 pages, 600 specimens from Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Each of these have a little name written in underneath. It's not clear when that was done. Okay. So a little more context, social context about the birth of the modern herbarium. By the 1700s, the age of exploration was going full throttle. European nations had funded exploration efforts worldwide, and commercial interests such as the Dutch East India Company were bringing vast specimen collections, associated paintings, notes, and live plants and animals back. And this diversity was shaking up the concept of the limits of biodiversity of the time. Much of the exploration was funded by wealthy patrons who were eager to collect, and especially in the case of plants, to grow these novelties. In other words, to enjoy biodiversity for its own sake, in addition to the practical uses of spices, medicine, and food. This was also the age of enlightenment, in which European societies were wealthier, better educated, and emboldened to shed superstition and to challenge church doctrine in favor of rational thought. This included the study of and making logical sense of the world. But how to organize it all? In the midst of this, Linnaeus burst on the scene with his twin ambitions to organize all of biodiversity in a rational way and to devise practical methods for doing so. So, enter the Herbarium Cabinet. This one was designed by Linnaeus for his growing collection in Uppsala. This is a photo of as it existed in the 1930s in London. His widow sold his collection of 14,000 specimens to a member of the Royal Society, and that collection, plus most of the cabinet, is still there and stored and available to the public in London. So the Herbarium Cabinet consists of 3 wooden cabinets in the center, housing the specimens themselves. And then importantly, there's a library of books on either side, and those contain the information relating to the specimens themselves. One more key feature is the shelves are adjustable to add more specimens as they poured in. So a design for the herbarium was published. Linnaeus was keen for all botanists, as well as all other ologists, to standardize their specimen management. And so in his Philosophia Botanica, he laid out how collecting and collections management was to be done: standard paper size, glue only one specimen per sheet, which is not what was typical in the day. People wanted to save money on paper. They'd fill a sheet. He even suggested what type of glue to use. Most especially, he devised a system of organizing the collection, which was according to his famous sexual system, to group plants according to increasing numbers of anther and pistil parts. So you can see the numbers correspond to his different floral formula groups. Contrary to what I learned in school, he didn't consider that sexual parts actual indication of relationship. It was merely, apparently, a way to retrieve specimens. Using sex as a mnemonic, it still works. The innovation of a single specimen per sheet of paper facilitated comparison of things when they came in and easy revision of the filing order. So his zealous practicality was greater than the sum of its paper and glue parts. It was a roadmap for the rationalization of world biodiversity and for scientists to communicate more efficiently about it. For the communication part, his advocacy of the Latinized two-part name instead of a long Latin descriptor, and his standard of using a single type specimen to define each species and to publish that official description, in his case in Species Plantarum, is justly what he is most known for. So here's a specimen out of that cabinet. You can see that it's on a standardized paper size. You can also see that there remained some problems with the paper. It looks like it wrinkled when the glue was added. This was probably collected for him by his student Herr Kalm, who collected in North America between 1749 and 1751. This description of this type was published in the first volume of Species Plantarum in 1753. So the species number and the sheet number are on the sheet. Here's the second sheet. So there's a species number, but the gluing of the label information was actually a later innovation. Remember, he had the information stored on each side of his cabinet. So just an aside about Ceanothus americanus, New Jersey tea. It's widespread in the eastern U.S. The common name derives from it being used as one of the beverages of last resort after a certain group of colonists dumped a certain shipment of tea into Boston Harbor. It doesn't contain caffeine, so it was very rapidly supplanted by coffee as the patriotic beverage of choice. Here's a modern 1995 collection of the same plant. Almost 250 years later, and it largely follows Linnaeus' protocol, a reproductive portion of the plant glued on paper with an herbarium number for record keeping. This one also has a barcode herbarium number, so another modern innovation. There's a fragment packet to contain extra parts, possibly extra leaves for DNA analysis, or to retain parts that fall off the specimen. When you have something that will last for hundreds of years, you have to plan for things like bits falling off now and then. Then there's the especially important innovation of the herbarium label. And most of you have written these, but gluing it on the sheet, of course, avoids the separation of the plant and its information. And then for those who haven't written herbarium labels, it's a very succinct form of prose, and if written well, should answer most questions that a future researcher might have without causing them to have to chase down original information. Location would be on it, substrate, habitat, population size, associated species, and traits such as scent, size, or flower color that might not transfer well to a 2D dried state. On this label, the curator has added in pencil a date, which may be the accession date, and also the family name. But interestingly, the specimen still bears L for Linnaeus, the authority who described it. So 250 years later, his original species has not been updated or modified. So this gives you a little bit of a summary of what the breadth of the system that Linnaeus devised, and most importantly, that he promoted it heavily and got lots of people to adopt it, and it has been found to work very well over time. Plants dried and pressed and put onto paper, which is also made from other plants, are remarkably impervious to deterioration if protected from excess light, extreme heat, dampness, and a few pesky species that like to eat cellulose. So, like the Linnaeus system of storing, Linnaeus system of specimens, the system of storing them has had its innovations over the years. They're now mostly arranged according to a taxonomic hierarchy and alphabetical organization, but the modern plan adheres to Linnaeus's original concept. We are lucky to have a large number of herbaria of various sizes distributed across California, holding collectively several million specimens. The Index Herbariorum, database of official herbaria worldwide, lists 109 official active herbaria in our state. Some of them are quite small, but Len will talk about the important functions of small herbaria. Here's a large one, the second largest in the United States in St. Louis, where I went to grad school. It has nearly 7 million specimens, an extremely large collection center. There's 2 buildings, and this one has compactors on wheels to save floor space between collections. So worldwide, there are 3,000 herbaria and some 380 million plant specimens. Other things have changed over time. We use Ziploc bags instead of metal boxes to collect plants. We use corrugated cardboard instead of presses in our plants. Other things have maybe not changed so much. So where do you, the modern botanist, plant ecologist, habitat modeler, restoration ecologist, fit into this picture? Let's see. Why would you spend the time to cut, saw, dig up plants and suffer what has been, must be one of the single most irksome experiences in botany, which is carefully arranging and pressing plants in newspaper outdoors on a windy day? And then, why would you then spend even more time indoors composing and printing labels and bringing the specimens to an herbarium to be mounted in accession? Well, let me give you several reasons. One, it could be a lot more disgusting. We're working with organisms composed of cellulose. 2, you can help collect plants maybe, but that's the easy part. Specimens have a way of building up fast. My sister, ever helpful, has pointed out to me that most people that come into my home cannot tell this kind of hoarding from the regular kind. I see some looks of consternation out there. There's some recognition of the problem. Okay, reason 3. Peter Raven tells me he came up with this aphorism when he was 12. He was a precocious kid. He's a world-renowned botanist. He's looking straight at you when he says this. The voucher remains the ultimate reference. It is the only truly reliable, definitive way for you to prove that what you saw, what you wrote about, what you based that elaborate thesis on is really what you say it is. And this isn't going to change anytime soon. Reason 4. The work is not done, but not very many people are still doing it. California plant collecting volume appears to have peaked in the 30s during the Wieslander years, but the sampling coverage, especially of currently known of common taxa, remains relatively poor. One good way to learn this method is to get involved in herbarium community by joining a collecting party, such as this annual 3-day retreat and collecting for it hosted by the University of Washington Herbarium. They go to under-collected areas each year, and every outing includes a chocolate dessert contest. So, reason 5, your specimens will have a career of their own after they leave your hands. Over the next several hundred years, they will inform studies that you can't even imagine now. For example, digitization has been a big push in the past couple of decades, cleverly funded through research initiatives by smart directors from grants from the National Science Foundation. Through this effort, even small herbaria can have their database searchable online. Carl and Alice would have been thrilled. Enormous numbers of specimens are now being imaged, and boy does that make me more effective researcher when I don't have to get off my butt every time I want to use a particular image about a specimen for this talk. Other initiatives will be talked about later in this conference. There are many more ways they are being used, informing restoration, restoring extirpated plant communities, and even tracking the existence of pathogens in the 19th century. Reason number 6, this is your built-in community. Maybe you find herbaria intimidating, but if you get to know one or two, you will actually find they are just the opposite. They're populated by a worldwide community of people like you who share passion for natural science. They are refugia of the Age of Enlightenment, where rationalism and an extremely long-term, forward-thinking scientific effort prevails. You don't need to know anything to get started. You may find, if you check their website, that there are events that pique your particular interest. And although I couldn't find any pictures of people having fun in 19th century herbaria, they had to hold still too long for the camera to make that happen. There have been parties going on, at least for the last 50 years. So find an herbarian to support you as a person and you as a scientist. All right, and I'd like to thank the various curators of many herbaria that helped provide these wonderful images. And there's a little, if you can't read it, the Linnaeus sign on the herbarium wall at Humboldt State says, an herbarium is much better than an illustration, and every botanist should make one. Thank you.